Ukraine has blasted Russia with at least 2 more volleys of long-range ATACMS missiles, but it hasn't stopped Russian forces advancing at the fastest rate. Since the start of the war, their troops are seizing around 2 football pitches worth of territory every minute this month. We're in Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Russia has vowed to retaliate after Ukraine has launched at least 2 more strikes with its long-range ground-launched ATACMS missiles. These are the American ground-launched missiles, which have a range of about 190 miles and which were used for the first time just this month when President Biden reversed a long-standing ban on using these weapons to hit targets inside Russia. The first strike came on November the 19th against an ammunition dump in Bryansk. Since then, we saw 2 days later, on the 21st of November, the first use of the British Storm Shadow air-launched bunker-busting stealth cruise missiles from Ukrainian planes, and they, we understand, hit a Russian military base in Kursk where North Korean soldiers were also based. And there was some confusion, some reports that perhaps a general or multiple generals had been killed. The latest detailed report I've seen suggested that a North Korean general was injured and a number of North Korean officers were killed, and that was reported in the Financial Times. On the 23rd of November, Russia claims that ATACMS missiles were used to hit an S-400 air defense battery in Kursk. The S-400 is Russia's most advanced air defense battery, and subsequent to that attack, on the 25th of November, there was what was then the 3rd ATACMS strike against the Kalino airfield, also in Kursk, and one can only presume that perhaps the S-400s may have been taken out to clear the path for that strike on the airfield. Now, hitting Russian airfields has been one of the main reasons that Ukraine has for so long demanded permission to use these weapons against targets in Russia. As the head of Britain's Royal Air Force said, Ukraine cannot put up a screen to defend itself from the tens of thousands of glide bombs that are being blasted at it from Russian jets. The best thing Ukraine can do is hit the jets when they're on the ground and hit the airfields themselves. That forces the planes to use airfields which are further away, forces them to carry more fuel. It means they can carry fewer bombs per sortie. Now, all of these strikes have elicited fury from Moscow, and we saw last week, and we talked at length in last week's update about that hypersonic missile strike on a factory, a rocket factory in the central city of Dnipro. We're going to come to that. Russia has said just in the last few days that it is preparing retaliatory actions in response to these recent ATACMS strikes. So what could that retaliation look like? Well, that brings us to that hypersonic strike on Dnipro. In our last video, we referred to it as an intercontinental ballistic missile because that is what Ukraine had called it hours after the strike, based on their preliminary radar tracking data. Subsequently, just almost as soon as we recorded that update, it emerged that in fact this missile was a medium-range hypersonic missile. It was a new experimental type of missile which Russia called an Oreshnik. It was based on the RS-26 Rubezh missile, which is an intercontinental ballistic missile. This was a slightly smaller variant of it. Essentially, in many ways, so really crude terms, same kind of tube, but less fuel and more warhead, so it can fly less far. That makes it a medium-range missile, or in the jargon, an intermediate-range ballistic missile, an IRBM, as opposed to an intercontinental ballistic missile, an ICBM. Nonetheless, still, we understand the first time a weapon with such a range has been used in anger in Europe. Now, curiously, Russia's TASS state news agency reported that Moscow alerted the United States 30 minutes before the launch to tell them this was happening. Now, that is following a protocol under a 1987 treaty under which both sides inform each other of missile tests to avoid these tests being misconstrued as nuclear launches. It's a mechanism, a sort of fail-safe communication channel to try and avoid an accidental World War III, one side misinterpreting the other's test as a nuclear attack. Now, obviously that's curious because Russia did present this use of this experimental missile as a test, but Moscow said it had been tested in combat. Now, what we know about the Oreshnik is limited, as I said, based, we think, on the RS-26, the Rubezh missile, but modified so that it can carry, according to a report in the New York Times, 6 warheads, and on each of those warheads can carry 6 sub-munitions. And what we saw in that footage from last week was multiple explosions, multiple, it looked like sort of simultaneous or near simultaneous rockets hitting that site, and that was likely the multiple re-entry vehicles, and that's when these missiles plummet down from the edge of space. Their warheads sort of scatter and disperse to make them harder to intercept, and that's a technology that has been around for many, many decades, developed as part of the nuclear arms race at the peak of the Cold War. What other retaliatory responses might we expect from Russia? Well, this week we've also seen one of the largest waves of drone strikes in the nearly 3 years of conflict. Some 188 drones were launched at targets right across Ukraine, many of them shot down, but damage caused by the debris and damage caused by drone strikes. Russia is continuing its attempt to try and cripple and eliminate or annihilate Ukraine's energy infrastructure. That has a sort of two-pronged purpose. One is to try and crush the morale of Ukrainian people, plunge them into cold and darkness as the winter temperatures plummet, and also to inhibit Ukraine's missile and weapons manufacturing capabilities. Clearly those plants rely on power which comes from these power generation stations and the distribution network. The other thing we might expect to see is not just in Ukraine, but is a response to the wider community. Now, the Kremlin was pretty clear in its saber-rattling threats that its response to strikes with these ATACMS and with Storm Shadows against targets in Russia is that Russia sees itself entitled to target the countries that are helping Ukraine. And that is, of course, the United States, that is the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and other major allies. We have seen and we continue to see ongoing evidence of suspected Russian sabotage. That includes attempts to put combustible devices, which we understand were actually massage devices or concealed as massage devices, on freight airliners as part of a plan to try and get effectively fires on board planes and possibly to bring down planes bound for North America and Canada. We've seen people arrested in Lithuania, people arrested, we've seen fires at a warehouse in Germany, fires at a DHL warehouse in Birmingham. There's also been a freight airliner has crashed in Lithuania. It's not clear the cause of that accident, but impossible not to see it in context of these wider threats. And of course this week, yesterday and almost every day for the last 7 days, there have been unidentified mystery drones harassing US air bases in the United Kingdom. Now, these are Royal Air Force bases, but which are predominantly used by the US Air Force. They are RAF Mildenhall, RAF Lakenheath, RAF Feltwell, all in East Anglia, in Norfolk and Suffolk. Lakenheath is where the F-35 Lightning jets and the F-15Es are based. It is also the base that is due to host, or may host in the near future, American nuclear missiles, and we know that because of planning applications and funding proposals which have gone through Congress. Today, reports have emerged that there have also been drones spotted at RAF Fairford in Gloucestershire. That is a extremely long runway where the American B-52 strategic long-range bombers land. When they come over from America, they land and refuel there before continuing training missions in and around Europe. So it's not clear at this stage who's behind these drone strikes. None of the drones, as far as I'm aware at the time of speaking and recording, have been successfully captured. But we know that the Royal Air Force Force Protection Wing, that's soldiers from the RAF regiment, have deployed with a system known as AUKUS, a counter-drone system known as AUKUS, to try and defeat them, track them and bring them down. What's happening in the rest of Ukraine's battlefield? Well, that is the rate of Russian advance that I mentioned at the very beginning. There's been no let-up in this relentless assault that we've seen, particularly around Kupiansk in northeastern Kharkiv province, and continuing down in the sort of southeastern corner of the front line around Kharkova, and that's part of the Russian offensive to try and sweep up towards Pokrovsk, an important road and railway junction. Russian forces have claimed that they've entered the outskirts of Kharkova. They've been fighting in the built-up area, and that's a town that I visited. Indeed, I travelled from there to Marinka, which is now firmly in Russian control. According to the Institute for the Study of War, Russian forces are advancing, or have advanced, over the course of November at an average rate of 22 square kilometres a day. That's about 8.5 square miles a day. Another way of looking at that is that's the equivalent of seizing 2 football pitches every minute. It's significant, and of course we heard from the British Defence Secretary, Frontline's as unstable now as at any point in the war. But the Institute for the Study of War, which looks at this really closely, sort of stressed the point that whilst this is an increase in the rate of advance, it is not nearly as fast as almost a 490 square miles a day that Russia was seizing in those first weeks of the war. And despite these battlefield gains, actually what we're seeing in Moscow is that the ruble, the Russian currency, has sort of plunged to its weakest level since March 2022. So it's almost as if there's a correlation between the speed of Russian advance and the weakness of its currency, although that collapse in the currency seems to be more linked to the latest round of American sanctions. As ever, if you're watching this on YouTube and you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as possible next week. And I'll also get into the comments myself and answer some of the questions there as well. Question number 1, is Ukraine winning? Ukraine is still in the fight, and that is Ukraine's most phenomenal achievement. But as I've said, Russia is the country that is advancing at the moment. Russia appears to have the upper hand. However, wars are not linear. Momentum is hugely important, and it does feel like on the battlefield, the positional conflict on Ukrainian turf, that Russia has momentum. But it's only been a week that Ukraine has had permission to use these weapons against targets in Russia, and that may change some of the dynamics. But right now, there's no denying it, Russia has the upper hand. Question number 2, if American and British contractors are firing weapons from Ukraine into Russia, is that not a declaration of war? Now, this comment, and indeed many of the comments that we saw under last week's video, appear to be taking a very sort of Moscow-centric point of view on this conflict, and I interpret that question to suggest that the ATACMS missiles and the Storm Shadow missiles that we've been talking about are effectively being fired or directed by British and American contractors. Now, does that amount to a declaration of war? Is that even happening? How is that happening? Well, exactly how America and Britain are enabling these weapons to hit targets is kept secret. We don't know the details. We do know, for example, that Germany, though, has resisted giving its Taurus cruise missiles because it was concerned that in order for them to be used, German personnel would have to be directly involved in the sort of process of preparing the missiles for launch. If that's been outsourced to contractors, does that mean that the home countries of those contractors have declared war on Russia? Well, quite simply, the answer is no. Britain and America have made no secret of the fact that they support Ukraine, they are arming Ukraine, they are funding Ukraine, but they have not declared war on Russia. And that remains an important distinction, because it's what distinguishes this incredibly bloody, dangerous and hot conflict from all-out direct confrontation between NATO states and Russia, which fundamentally spirals into an out-of-control World War III. I know a lot of you in the comments say, how is this different from World War III? And we've addressed that in the past. Question number 3, how many ATACMS are there? How long will it last? It's a really good question. I don't know the answer. I can't tell you exactly how many ATACMS Ukraine has or how many America is going to provide. Similarly, we don't know how many Storm Shadow missiles Ukraine has. We do understand that another delivery arrived very recently in the weeks before this change of policy. So Ukraine has a sort of Its arsenal has been replenished, but clearly these are precious, expensive weapons and they are used sparingly against high-value targets. Question number 4, why doesn't Ukraine's allies give everybody solar panels to try and beat the Russian attacks on energy infrastructure throughout the winter? It's an interesting idea. One of the problems for Ukrainians is that a lot of their homes have centralized heating systems. So sort of water is heated at central locations and then pumped around municipal buildings and apartment blocks to try and keep people warm. And solar energy, I haven't looked at this in great detail, but solar panels in the winter, when the weather's bad, when the weather's cold, unlikely to be able to replicate that level of energy. But certainly when we've been traveling in Ukraine and when we've been traveling to places that have had no electricity because Russia has knocked out the infrastructure, we have relied on large battery packs, and we've traveled with solar panels as well. But to be honest, most of the time just charge these batteries off vehicles. Fifth and final question today, is it usual for governments to know 24 hours in advance before there is a major missile strike like that hypersonic strike, that Oreshnik we saw last week? This question, I think, is referring to the fact that America closed its embassy the day before that strike. Is it normal? Well, intelligence services all around the world spend a huge amount of effort and resources in monitoring their adversaries' militaries and postures. And in order for a launch like this to happen, there will be various indicators, various things have to change in the run-up to that firing. And it is likely, I'm speculating here, but it's likely that American intelligence and Allied intelligence saw changes in the Russian posture. They may have had other secret means of gleaning this information, and that gave them some advanced warning of what was happening. Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey said Russia had been preparing this strike for months. So that gives you another indication that the West had been looking at this very closely. As ever, if you do have questions, please do ask them in the comments below, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can next time.